there are multiple observers, multiple ETs looking at Earth, but they are looking from different perspectives. We are talking about life forms that are not only sharing the same space and the same time and the same location that we do, but they have like stacked up frequential realms, other dimensions, very exotic types of realms and realities. The Greys, one of the most invasive species, or let's say one of the most popular and most widespread species too. So much interesting stuff that is coming on normstream television. People talking about ETs in congressional hearings. We do have the discoveries of the pyramids, that we have basically these coils underneath the pyramids. We have encounters more than ever. People uploading their ET stuff every day on TikTok and Instagram. It's ballooning up, and everyone can see that. Everyone feels that something is happening on the planet, and that has to do with the change in policies as well. We're coming from a history where ET contacts and spirituality in general was seen as dangerous when it's in the hands of the global population, and also was ridiculed for quite some time, for the reason traditionally, in order to figure out what the whole subject is about. We're talking about World War II, where a lot of the sightings in the Western culture have basically begun. Then we have Roswell, which was a big milestone, 1947. 2 weeks later, the president signed basically an act to establish the CIA, which was pulled up from the ground in 2 weeks, which is incredible. That shows how relevant that topic was at that time. We came quite a long way, and 80 years later, me studying and being 18 and being offered a job in the field of first of all, it was like political analysis and certain projects, and then later on going into governance, and then it took 4 years until I was even close to realizing, what rabbit hole I actually got into. And things are changing. We do see that, the United States now has the Space Force. Any big country has a Space Force too, and not so popular, not so in the face of everyone, but Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, China, they all established their own versions of Space Force. And that makes the recruitment process a lot easier, and we will going into a time where people will be doing interviews and recruitment centers of going into exopolitics and going into the stars in a certain way. That's a fascinating time, I guess.
Could you share with us maybe just one of the interactions you have had with an extraterrestrial species to give our audience a flavor of the types of interactions you have had?
Yeah, for sure. So basically, the recruitment process. So no one back, in that phase, and still, no one would be interviewed, and you wouldn't find like an open vacancy for like ET extraterrestrials or exopolitics or something like that. So it used to be a process of being recruited that was fairly odd. I gotta say, fairly intransparent, and it took quite some years just in order to get the background checks and the emotional capacities and so many other factors just in place. And that led me quite far down the rabbit hole in a certain way. And some of the interactions, basically they're called transmissions. So anything that certain groups on this planet catch from whatever source, that's all been collected, analyzed, and scanned for potential benefit and harm. So both sides are being reflected, and that can be anything. So it can be as mundane as like a sound file that comes from space, and it's just where people not typically me. I was more in like the communication governance sector, but there are analysts out there who look at these transmissions, and they think, they look at these things and see if a tone is actually a reflection of the space or certain other physical phenomena, is there intelligence behind that has, because the range and the variance, the variety of different forms of communication in the universe is spectacular. Far beyond what humans would naturally think is communication can still be communication. But we also do have, video material that was analyzed. I've seen that in rare times, a few times. I've seen video material where it was like, pulled as like an insider for a certain project. And there are other people working on other stuff too. I was especially recruited and thrown into the cold water of so-called exotic species, which are basically anything that is that doesn't look like a human, and that doesn't walk like a human, and that might be a little further out there than the typical form of ETs. Because the interesting thing is we have basically two categories of non-terrestrial life forms, and one of them is the horizontal line, which is basically anything that falls under the same type of category of life that we have on planet Earth. So anything that looks distantly like a human, anything that breathes the same air, and has mostly the same type of capabilities than humans have, plus minus a couple million years, I would say. That's the horizontal line. And then you have a vertical line, and then that is where it gets really exotic, because then we are talking about life forms that are not only sharing the same space and the same time and the same location that we do, but they have like stacked up frequential realms, other dimensions, very exotic types of realms and realities. And not to spoil this version of the universe that we are living in is not the only one. There are quite a number of other versions of the universe where life is very different compared to what we see here. And that was basically my expertise. And for that, we delved into the Greys, which it's not their original name. That is something that humans have given them in order to describe them due to their gray-skinned nature. One of the most invasive species, or let's say one of the most popular and most widespread species too, because they appear everywhere in pop music and pop culture and so on. So there was quite a large interest in figuring out what their interest was. And the second species, or the second life form actually that we were looking into, is a project that had a long tradition in Central Europe, dating back to the 1940s, where basically the Germans at that time and certain other nations were quite newly tapping into quantum physics and the realization that there might be life behind the veil of reality, the veil of what we can perceive. So the idea in the 1940s was there might be a life form outside of the visible spectrum and perceivable, the event horizon, if you want to call it that way. So there might be something behind that, a designer, a God, if you want to call it that way. And in the 1940s, one of those projects, archaic projects at that time, was trying to get into contact with that life form, mostly for geopolitical reasons, which is laughable if you think about that from the perspective of a cosmic life form.
From your perspective as an insider, what have you learned through all these videos you've seen, through all this audio, and of course, all the documentation you've read through? What has been your perspective on our origins as the human race?
I think one of the most interesting things to me to learn was that even the very, very far developed and very carefully collecting information, information-wise, very carefully collecting species out there do not agree upon the same history of Earth. That is very, very right. I found that super interesting because the first thing, the way that history is explained to humans, and back then, I was, formally trained, so my perspective of history was linearly, unfolding in a certain way. So the idea of a human would be something has to come before something, and it starts somewhere. But that is not quite the reality that the universe is far more complex and exotic and maybe weird, if we want to use that word, than just the linear perspective. And to me, it was fascinating to see that there were different species, because the first reaction is, are they lying to us? Is there, are they hiding? Why are there, two witnesses who are actually talking about the same time, but they have completely different versions of what happened? And that can only be explained and understood when we realize that the perspective of the observer is determining what we are actually looking at in the quantum universe. That's all that it is, right? So the idea is there are multiple observers, multiple ETs looking at Earth, but they are looking from different perspectives, from their own timelines, from their own position in time-space. And that can change radically what they're actually looking at. And then the universe comes in, and it has a fantastic, almost like a nonchalant type of melting everything together into one hot pot of history, which then also includes certain glitches in the matrix, basically. Like the infamous Mandela effect, and people that remember the loom and fruit of the loom, and certain all these things that you can find everywhere on the. I personally, I had that one moment. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but there was one commercial of a baseball player who was basically catching a ball in front of a journalist, and I think it was a Pepsi, one of these thingy beverage commercials or so. The interesting thing is that I was clearly remembering a blonde person who was doing the interview. And even AI does. So I asked ChatGPT about it, and ChatGPT was saying it's a blonde woman, and her name is, and she's, journalist from, and so on. Interestingly enough, if you now look at YouTube, you only find a dark-skinned Afro-American woman who's doing the interview. So even these things change.